Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new Securing Bridges podcast. You're about to join Alyssa Miller as she sits down with senior and executive security leaders to share stories of success and failure while working across business teams. It's time to build and secure the bridge to the business. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome aboard another week of Securing Bridges. Yes, I'm Alyssa Miller, your host, and here we are once again, second episode. Super excited. Securing Bridges, this is where we're talking to security leaders about how we connect those concepts of cybersecurity with the rest of the business who sometimes doesn't really want to hear from us, or maybe they just don't get it. So we're talking with leaders every week about how do we get better? How can we have those conversations and make them meaningful so that we can connect with the business? We can build those bridges between our security teams and the business line. So we've got another amazing guest. Last week, we had Keon Williams. If you missed that episode, I encourage you, go out there, find it on YouTube, and you can watch the replay, or you can check out the podcast version if you go to itspmagazine.com. But this week, we have another amazing guest, somebody I know you've probably heard of before. We've got Accidental CISO here with us. Hey, AC, how are you?
I am doing very well. How are you doing?
I am doing great. So just in case, there might be like one, maybe two people out there who haven't somehow heard of you yet. Tell us just a little bit about yourself, kind of your journey in cybersecurity.
Yeah. So as the handle would apply or imply, I accidentally became the CISO. Something that in my travels and based on the number of people that I have talked to in the last few years, it happens on a pretty regular basis, actually, in organizations, folks who are doing IT or security adjacent work, maybe product work, and they end up having the security leadership role thrust upon them, for better or for worse. For me, I think, when the first time I realized that that's what was happening, and I asked who the security officer was, and they told me that it was me. There was some gnashing of teeth and swearing and that sort of thing. But I've grown to embrace it. Spent a lot of my career in IT, but it was in IT and networking and security industry and that sort of thing. And I was in a lot of orgs where I was the only person as well. So I had to wear all of the hats. So it really wasn't until I accidentally became the CISO and had to come to terms with that, that I really realized that, you know what, I've been a security person all along, because that was the approach I took to things when I was doing my IT work and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's been a wild ride through a lot of small businesses and through some very large companies in the process, and some spin-offs and startups and spin downs and what have you along the way.
Sure. So tell us a little bit more. We won't belabor it too much, but I got to know, how does one get in a situation where you're asking who is the CISO and then they're pointing the finger back at you?
Exactly. So in my case, I actually had left a prior company because I could see the writing on the wall that I was going to be owning security in a very large company. It was rapidly growing, quickly approaching about 1,000 people in the security space. And as such, the company was going to be a target as well. And I realized, I don't know if I really want to own security here. I wanted to run IT and do what I thought was my background and my wheelhouse of DevOps and IT infrastructure and operations and support and all of that. And I left that company to go to a small startup and was just going to be helping on the product team with DevOps and kind of leaving a senior leadership role and kind of go to be mostly an individual contributor to kind of take a break from that stress. And it turned out pretty quickly that the questionnaires that they would get from customers and other things, like nobody really knew how to answer them. And the language and the way things were worded were difficult. And I was able to parse those and translate those into English of this is what they're asking and why it's important. And very, very quickly, I think within 2 to 3 weeks of my starting, an email went out from the chief operations officer to the entire company that says, go to AC, he's a security guy. Any security questions? And I wasn't the security officer yet at that point, but it was shortly after that we needed to do some security audit stuff for customers. They were asking for SOC 2 reports. They wanted us to get high trust certification because we were in the healthcare industry. And, so going through the process of doing those assessments and preparing for SOC 2 and high trust, one of the questions that came up during those was, we had to name a security officer. We had to document this in our security program. And so as I'm pulling all this documentation together and making sure we have policies and procedures and a written information security plan, I had to ask who the security officer was, and was told, no, that's you, buddy. Sorry about your luck. So that was kind of how it happened. And it happens a lot, actually, as organizations start to document their security programs. Somebody needs to be named as responsible. And just in the last couple of years, as I've been helping people build their security programs as sort of a vCISO, I've had conversations 3, 4, 5 times just in the last year, maybe a little more than a year, with different clients where the conversation came up when they had to decide, like, who's this going to be in the org and who should it be based on accountability structures and the way the org's structured and that kind of stuff.
So it's almost alarming, quite honestly, when you say that, because it's you start to realize that so many organizations don't even think about the CISO as a role that they need until suddenly something's forcing their hand.
Yep.
And I think that's a story we see quite often in, certainly smaller and medium-sized businesses like you discussed. Usually by the time you get to a large enterprise organization, usually they've kind of figured that out. But when you get in those conversations, what do they typically sound like? I mean, is it legitimately like all they know is they've got to fill in a blank on a form somewhere to name somebody? Or do you feel like more of them come to the table kind of understanding what the role is and they know they need to fill it?
Yeah, usually for me, it comes up as we're doing sort of a readiness assessment where they're giving me the narrative of all of their controls and describing what they do have in place within their security program. And one of the questions I just straight up have to ask them is, who is named as the security officer? Is somebody named as security officer? Who is that person in your documentation? And almost every time it happens, somebody's not named. Sometimes it's named by a role, but that role may not actually be filled in the org chart or whatever. Maybe it'll be referred to as the security officer, but then in the org chart, it's not actually, pinned on somebody. So we have to take a look at that and help them there. And it tends to happen mostly in smaller orgs. There's a certain level of scale as the org grows where, having this more formal organizational structure, separation of roles and responsibilities and stuff starts to happen. And you just kind of by design end up with somebody owning security as the organization matures and grows. But in small orgs, 20, 50, maybe up to 100 people or so, especially, like you don't really see that. And there's a lot of separation of roles and responsibilities, especially on the smaller end of that, is very difficult. So people wear the hat and maybe don't even realize they're wearing it. Or a lot of times the organization didn't realize it was a hat that needed to be worn.
When you have those conversations, what kind of justification do you give them? I mean, is it because I assume, and maybe wrongly, I don't know, but I would assume probably try to give them a little bit more than, oh, it's, something that's required to, it's a spot you need to fill on your SOC too. I mean, how do you actually tell, say, a CFO or a COO or maybe a CIO, hey, you've got to appoint somebody as your security officer, and here's the value you get from that.
Yep. So a lot of times they're not looking, they're not engaging with somebody like me to come in and help them build a program if they don't have some sort of business driver already. And for a lot of these customers, that business driver is, they've got some sort of regulatory compliance, some new legislation or something that that they either just realized they need to comply with, or that was just signed into law or something you're going to have to comply with. Sales friction is another one. They're losing sales, or their sales cycles are really long because they don't have a SOC 2 report. They don't have the documentation. They don't have the good answers in their questionnaires that they're doing, and it's either costing them sales or extending the time that it takes them to make the sales. And the sales cycle is another important piece of that. Nobody's really doing it, for security's sake. Some orgs have had an incident, ransomware, whatever, and now they're realizing, like, hey, we need to, firm up our security program in the process because of that. But there's usually that business driver in the first place that makes them say, hey, we need to build a security program in the first place. Like, trying to convince somebody that security is important if they don't already feel that it's important is kind of a difficult thing to do. So by the time I'm helping them, it's they've already kind of come across that hurdle. There's a business driver of some sort, and as they're starting to understand, one of the things that I make sure that I highlight as I'm talking to them is how broad security is, because there's usually that idea that it's just IT. It's just
Mhm.
IT security, all technical, and they don't realize how security is going to transcend the entire organization, and it's going to transcend all of your business processes and everything from the way you onboard and hire people to the way you do sales and deliver your product, whether it's a service or a physical product, the way you manage your supply chain, whether it's a digital supply chain or a physical supply chain, all of those things, like, it's going to impact everything in the way you operate the business. And I try to position. I don't like. I hate the FUD approach. So I try to position it as well from an enablement uh, perspective on this, and they can start to understand that when they realize kind of how broad this is, and that this really is about enabling the business, that we really do need somebody who's going to be accountable for this, because this isn't going to be successful if we don't have somebody who is accountable to help build the program. And I also help that person as they're coming to grips with the fact that, oh my God, I'm going to be the security officer. That doesn't mean they have to own everything. They're going to herd the cats. They're going to guide the company and kind of be that trusted advisor internally. But HR still has to own the onboarding process. IT still has to own the part of the process where you're completing onboarding and assigning access. Sales still has to own their sales. Ops still has to own the supply chain stuff, and manufacturing, or depending on what type of business it is. And that you're there to help them, but you can't just own everything end to end. They're going to have to step up, and that seems to be something that a lot of them hadn't really given much thought to.
So there's a ongoing, and this goes back almost as long as I can remember in my security career, this sort of debate over what is the most appropriate organizational structure. Where should the CISO report to? And do you end up landing in those conversations? And what do you, in your opinion, where should that CISO align and why?
Yeah, sometimes it does. There's usually not that much, I don't want to say flexibility, because especially in small businesses, there's a lot of flexibility, and that's part of the challenge to it. But it's usually pretty clear in the org who that person needs to be. And then from there, they have to decide, whether or not reporting structures should change. A lot of times, they don't, in the purpose of building the security program initially. That usually going to be a down the road thing. A lot of times, it's IT folks that end up kind of getting saddled with it because they don't have a dedicated security person. And all of a sudden, the IT people are realizing like a large part of actually implementing the security controls ends up being done through IT. So, it tends to be somebody in IT that we're working with during the preparation phase that ends up being that that person that gets picked on and draws the short straw.
This is sounding so brutal.
Right.
Look out, run the other way fast.
It is brutal. As the org grows, like that's when you can start looking at, should security be a dedicated org? Should it be under a CIO, CFO, CEO, those types of things. But in smaller orgs, they're typically very flat. So there's not a whole lot of different places for them to report. And as you get to maybe orgs of 50, 60, 70 people, you start having those organizational structures and teams and managers of managers start to develop in the org. But if you're in the 20 to 50 person company range, they're still usually pretty flat, and not a lot of question about where should the person report, and it's more tactical about how do we get things done.
So you mentioned before a word that comes up more and more, I feel like, with CISOs these days, but there's a lot of different thoughts on what it actually means. And that is, you said that word enablement. And, on Securing Bridges, we're all about how do we connect the business and security. And a lot of that message seems to center quite often around enablement of the business. Mm-hmm. What does that mean to you when I say enablement? How does security actually enable the business?
Yeah, so there's a few ways that I look at it. One is looking at the organization, understanding how the organization works and makes money, but looking at the needs of the other teams. How can security support them and help them solve their problems and do it safely, rather than saying, hey, we have this security risk, this security problem, we need to implement X, Y, and Z controls, and you just have to do these things and do them differently. Getting to know those teams and establishing that bridge, that you were discussing, earlier as you were opening the show, like that relationship to them, to understand that you're there to help them. You're there to help them fix their pain points. Like that is one of the biggest ways to enable the business to me, because then you can design those security controls in concert with, IT and the folks that need to build the tooling and get the tooling in place, and the process owners, so that the right way, the official way to do it is also the secure way, and it's the streamlined way. And if you can bring in automation and tooling into that mix and do it well, it helps everybody be more efficient. But the other thing that I like to explain when it comes to security as an enabler for the business is, at the end of the day, like a security risk or something where a process breaks down and you have some sort of a security vulnerability where somebody can make a mistake. Like at the end of the day, it's a process quality issue. So again, if you're focusing on the quality of those processes, to know where to look to put your attention to help streamline and fix things, you can look at security almost as a form of operational excellence rather than just risk mitigation. And when you can start to look at security as a way to ensure operational excellence for the business, like now you're looking at how do we reduce overhead and friction and get into some of the other, I know there's, people have strong feelings of Six Sigma and some of these other things that have been done in the manufacturing space for a long time because they get implemented poorly. And we face the same thing in security. People implement security controls poorly and security gets a bad name. Same thing for Six Sigma and the continuous improvement and all those things, Deming and stuff that has been the basis of DevOps. If they're implemented poorly, they're going to give you a bad name. But at the same time, if you do them well, I mean, they can be game changers for a company in the market.
And you touched on one of the things that's so important to me. That is that idea of how do we move beyond just conversations about risk and bring something more meaningful. And so Frank brings up a really good question here as we think about it. And, he mentions it in terms of data governance and just overall, what does common language, how does that play into this? That seems like that would be something really important that we're all, we're speaking to the business in language they understand rather than, of course, coming to them with, the security ease, if you will.
Yeah. And not even like if I back up and sorry, Frank, because I'm going to dodge your question slightly by going up a level here. Governance in general is kind of that first step to get people aligned. If your organization doesn't understand what kind of compliance regulations and things that it needs to comply with in the first place, like that's kind of one of the first places you need to start is understanding what really are our requirements. Like, do we have compliance requirements by law, not just that we're going to choose for ourselves strategically, but like by law. And by starting to pull that stuff together and understanding and building kind of your custom framework, for the organization, you may base most of your program on NIST or ISO 27001 or something, but if there's other things you need to comply with and the organization recognizes that, you can layer those things in, but getting that buy-in at a high level that this is the framework that we're going to use. This is the aggregate composite framework that represents all of our responsibilities legally, whatever, from a compliance standpoint, as well as the ones that we have chosen to strategically align to build this. Like having that governance model in place, it makes it easier for other folks then in the organizations to do their jobs because it provides that framework for decision making. Governance is. I may geek out about this a little bit. So if I go too far down this rabbit hole, stop me and grab me by the tail and pull me back out. When you've got that framework, you can now take and create policies for the company that are well aligned with your strategy and this agreed upon, like these are our requirements. So you kind of get that buy-in already from senior leadership. And if you make those policies in clear language that people can support, now they can be reference documentation for other folks in the org as the org's growing. So many business people say hire great people and then get out of their way. But if you don't have a good framework for decision making in place, then they have nothing to base their decisions on as you get out of their way. And the last thing you want to do is have every decision be an exercise in judgment. And so where this really can come out, if you've got a software development team that's bringing a new technology into their stack, for instance, if you have your governance in place and your standards are established and everything is aligned and well documented, the team that's doing this now, they know what questions to ask. They know what the vendor needs to do, what they need to offer, all of that stuff. They know how to document the outcome and score and how the vendor stacks up against that in a way that it can be documented clearly and quickly, and so that they can make those decisions at a lower level in the company and they don't have to escalate back up the chain. And then executives just have to look at, they can go and verify the decisions. Was the decision made the way that we said we were going to make it? because that's ultimately where governance kind of comes down to, is it's deciding how you're going to decide. So it's a huge thing in businesses that want to move fast and do it safely. If you've got to reinvent the wheel for everything you do, it may feel like you're moving fast, but you're not. So having that governance in place, and for Frank's question about data governance, if you've got your rules and your policies, your standards all set, and people know exactly what they need to do. They know how the data is to be classified. They know how to handle different things. It's clearly laid out. The process is there. The tools are there. Nobody has to make a decision. You don't have that cognitive load of making a decision every step of the way. You can train people on how to do this stuff from a role-based training perspective as you're onboarding people, or as you're continuing to do, development, continuing education development, and that sort of thing within the org. Like they know what to do. They know what's expected of them. They know what's expected of each other. Like, so, it's kind of that if you think about it, if you had a sports team, or for those that are, into sports, if you have an orchestra who is going to play a concert, or they get a game on, a Sunday, and they're going to get together in the morning before the game and rehearse. And that's the only time they're going to practice before they go on stage or on the field, versus another team that actually practices regularly and does the fundamentals. Like, which team's going to perform better? Obviously, the team that has practiced the fundamentals. They know what they're expecting. They know what they can rely on the other team members for. It baffles me to see, and it's huge in startups, but to see leadership feel like, oh, well, we don't want to document things, that'll just slow us down, when it's completely the opposite. And I've literally had executives tell me that oh, we don't want to document anything because it's just going to slow us down, and they feel like they're moving fast, but at the end of the day, they could be moving a lot faster and a lot more efficient if their people could make decisions as low a level in the org as possible, and they know exactly what to do, and it's easy to document, and all the leadership has to do is say, yep, looks good, rubber stamp it, instead of having to have it go all the way up the chain every time for an exercise in judgment.
So on the flip side, then, is there a point where we become too reliant on governance to drive the security program? And I mean, we've all probably talked about the idea of checkbox compliance, and where we've got standards or things. I know that's something that comes up a lot when we talk about, like, PCI, for instance. For the longest time, that was how people felt, was that we were just checking boxes off of something to hit our compliance. Where does that border happen? How do we stay out of that mode and really make sure that our governance program and our compliance drives actual change in the organization?
Yep. We were talking on another conversation recently on a podcast episode about governance. And one of the things that I mentioned is a security exception process. The security exception process or program, as a subcomponent of your information security program, is a really critical piece of that, because it can help you get away from, well, we just have to do it this way because this is the standard, and how we've said we're going to do it, and the framework says we have to do it this way. It gives you a way to have and document your standards, have your program be a known quantity, but then at the same time, when you need to have a pressure relief to add flexibility to the program, you can have that process where somebody is able to submit an exception request, and it can be reviewed, and the risks associated with it can be analyzed, and the business can make a decision. Yep, we're willing to take that additional risk in this one case. We're going to grant that exception. It gets documented, it gets approved, and now that exception is enshrined kind of in the security program as well through this exception management program. And by doing it that way, then those exceptions can be reviewed on whatever periodic basis, whether that's quarterly or annually, or whatever it is you need to review on. And maybe each exception is different. Maybe you put one in and you're going to review it every 6 months, and another one's every year, and another one's every month, based on what's appropriate. But it gives you a lot of flexibility. Because the frameworks that we work with, like they tell you sort of the capabilities that you need to have, I guess, but they don't necessarily exactly tell you how to do them. Multi-factor authentication is one that comes up in almost all these frameworks at this point. Is having multi-factor authentication, like there's all sorts of different ways that you can do that within your org, and to figure out the best way for your organization in a way that makes sense and doesn't impede progress and still addresses those risks. And if you have a certain standard and then say, but for this particular system, maybe MFA is not required because of the way that particular system works or how it's isolated or something like that. Maybe it's a lobby kiosk that's made to be public. Well, of course, you're not going to put MFA on it. So you do a exception for that one thing, and you're off to go. So I want to tie in bridges here, because I was told we were going to talk about bridges, and I prepared for this, and then I was disappointed. Different types of bridges are going to perform differently. The concrete bridges of a highway overpass are very, very inflexible. They're very strong, but they're very inflexible. And then you have a suspension bridge, which is flexible and can move in the wind, but it's not as strong. And there's this balance that you have to play, whereas suspension bridge, though, requires a little more maintenance to get that flexibility. You're going to have the same thing in your security program. To be flexible and work with the business, you're going to have to accept the fact that maybe there's going to be a little more maintenance that goes along with your program, with exceptions and the way things are defined and the way your processes are defined, as well as the way your policies and control standards are written. Maybe you have to split control standards for a product different than internal IT or something, because product is operated in a totally different environment or in a totally different way, with DevOps and infrastructure as code, whereas your internal IT is still physical infrastructure or something, like, just because of those differences that, there's a little more maintenance because you need to be flexible.
Well done bringing the bridges into it. I like that. Very different metaphor than I was expecting, to say the least. But, and I think that's crucial, because what you just described to me really connects with how we mature a security program, right? The way I've always looked at it, if there's like a spectrum of your maturity in your security program, it's on the far end, you got basically nothing, right? It doesn't exist, and you kind of become more ad hoc. Then you kind of get in this mode where you're really reactionary. And that's where I feel like a lot of it gets driven by compliance, especially if you're a highly regulated organization. If you've got to meet PCI, HIPAA, or something, it's FFIEC if you're at a bank, or if you're like me in the market space, you're dealing with the SEC. When we're dealing with those, that becomes like that next thing, and it's still kind of a crutch. And what you just described, I think, is where we want to move to. And that is where now suddenly our cybersecurity program becomes more proactive, and our governance is maybe driving us to do things, as you said earlier, kind of down that path of least friction, or that paved road that ends up being the most secure. And then I feel like there's one more step after that, and that's really where we become innovative in security. And I'm curious your thoughts on that. Where is it that security can create innovation that propels the organization forward from a business perspective?
Yeah, it comes back to listening to your users, listening to the stakeholders and the folks that are actually relying on the systems and the processes to do the work for the company to make money. One of the things that I've loved about some of what Wolf Gorlick has tweeted is, compassion for users is just so important. And I think that's really the area that we have to innovate, where we get away from the older school of thinking with security, where you put up locks and gates and just boundaries and protection and that kind of stuff, and focus more on, like, what really is their need, what are they trying to do, what is causing them to go outside of the established norm? Because creative users, one of the favorite Wolf quotes in this is that creative users are dangerous users, or something like that. That, if your security controls are pushing people to get creative to get their work done, like, you're doing something horribly wrong, and it's going to come back and bite you, because they're going to work to get creative to work around the things that you're trying to do. So if you can work with them, like, that's where the real, I think, innovation comes in, is understanding what their goals are, what their needs are, and how do you meet their needs. And in doing that, you have to work with the IT group, you have to work with the HR group, you have to work with finance or other people, because every step of the way, maybe you've got IT tools, or maybe you've got training that needs to happen, maybe you've got I don't know, some sort of procurement thing and a finance process that needs to get adjusted. Like, there's all these different processes across the entire company that are constantly intersecting. And look, as a security practitioner, looking at that entire organization as a system, and being able to identify where those intersections happen and where friction is happening as a result, and being able to try and smooth those over. Like, that's the real room for innovation, I think, that we have now. And it's all based around user experience. I mean, even the tools that we trumpet and say, hey, we've got this great tool, this great solution, go use a password manager. I'm sorry, but usability on password manager sucks. Like, I use a password manager. I couldn't live without it. I don't know hardly any of my passwords. Like, I do what I'm supposed to do. I keep everything in it. They're long, they're random. I'm using MFA and all that kind of stuff. But I gotta be honest, the experience of it is terrible, especially when I go to my iPad and I'm trying to sign up for something from my iPad, and trying to use the auto-filling and getting a new password generated and created and stuff from my iPad instead. Like, it's pretty decent from a web browser on a PC. But, like, people aren't just using web browsers on PCs anymore. They're using iPads. Like, I mean, when I'm not working, my iPad kind of has become my personal computer. Our phones are our personal computers, but when it's a pain in the butt to get a new random password generated and created and populated as you're signing up for a new account for something. Like, if a professional like me is going, this sucks. Like, imagine how my mom feels, or your grandma, or, whoever, whatever non-technical, close relative, loved one you have. Like, that compassion is really important for us to figure out how do we do these things. So looking at it as, we give you these tools, but then also single sign-on, so you don't have to log in every single place, and smooth that up, and conditional access, so that maybe you don't have to do the MFA dance every time. Maybe you only have to do it when you're outside of, a normal location, or something. Sure. Where you in, like, there's different things that we can do to have compassion for the users, but there's a lot we can do within the organization as a system still, working cross-functionally. If we can just earn that trust with the different functional groups, and they understand that we're there to help them, it's huge. Like, we need to start thinking more like the COO does in companies that have to deal with entire systems of supply chains and production and distribution and all that kind of stuff. Like, if we start looking at the organization as systems the way the COO does, it gets easier.
So that's actually a bit of a good segue into my last question for you then. Again, talking a lot about some pretty high level leadership stuff here, right? I mean, these are conversations and things that, in larger organizations, they're the things that our executives and senior leaders are thinking about. So tying it back again now with that small business mindset, or even just, somebody who's newer in their career and looking to kind of progress, what's the one piece of advice you would leave them with that, you'd want them to take from this, as far as how they can move forward and start building some of this when maybe they don't have the influence of being a CISO or a director or a high level leader of some fashion.
It really is difficult when you're you accidentally become the CISO. Because when that happens, almost never is that person at the right place in the org to be fully effective. Like, the person doesn't accidentally become the CISO and they're already board reporting. Like, that just doesn't really happen. What happens is you have a manager or a director, down in the company, a step, 2 steps, 3 steps down into the company that has to now figure out how do I build this program. And to be effective, like it really, looking at the organization as a system is a part of it, and the other piece is building those relationships with the other stakeholders in the org that are going to be the ones that have to do a lot of the implementation work, or who are going to be directly impacted with it, and that you need to understand what they're doing in order to implement these controls well. So as somebody who's just coming into it, we as technical individual contributors tend to look more, I guess, vertically, sort of like we're used to staying in our vertical, our technical vertical. But when you start looking at trying to build a security program, like, you have to start looking horizontally across the entire system. And that is one of those areas that's really difficult, I think, for technical people to take off their technical hat and step away from, because most of us get into it because we're passionate about technology and we're fascinated by technology, and we love to, and every problem can be solved with technology, and we want to play with technology. But at the end of the day, like, none of that technology exists except to serve the business. When you're in the business, like, if you're in your home lab, you can play with technology for the sake of technology, but like in business, it has to serve the business. And the only way you're going to be able to get out of that is to get your head kind of up above and out of the weeds, the technical weeds, and stop thinking about the technology specifically for its own sake, and look at the technology as how does it serve the business, and horizontally across to those groups, and how am I going to serve this person. And there's a lot of the security controls that we'll implement. They're not technology, they're process based, and maybe there's a tool or something somewhere that supports that process. But at the end of the day, most of what we do is people and process and business, and maybe 25% technology. So that's, I think, my advice to folks that are looking to come up into this is to, start, if you've got a good grasp on the technology already, start studying business blogs, other types of things like that. Start studying process management, process improvement, some of the continuous improvement stuff. Like, we're used to seeing a lot of it in Scrum and Agile at this point. So it's, process improvement, continuous improvement is not foreign to a lot of technical people now, but just understanding that stuff and how to approach the problems and get to root causes and fix those at a business and process level, not just a technical level, is huge.
Yeah, so Frank had a comment in there while you were talking that I thought matched up really well with what you were saying at the time, and that was, you were talking about this working horizontally, and Frank mentions that what we hear too often in security is that we're too busy just doing the tactical to think strategically and try to make things better. And that's where I think that working horizontal can be your best ally as you start creating sponsors within the business across different business lines, different silos that exist. Those sponsors that you find, when you get their buy-in and you get them and they want to see you succeed, can offload a lot of that extra labor. So I think that was an awesome point there. And I agree with you totally about, if you want to move up, you want to get into leadership within cybersecurity. Yeah, learning the business side can just be invaluable.
And that too busy to make things better too is another, and it haunted me when I first was doing it. Like, it was a tough thing. Frank mentioned and echoed in here too. This is a hard shift to make, that tactical to strategic thinking. But that strategy is the important part. Is when you change your thinking to your governance is strategic. It's not a framework of a list of things you have to do. But if you start thinking about, this is our strategy of how we're going to do this and how we're going to make decisions and how we're going to make the company better and take us towards our other business goals and help us achieve those things, it gets easier then to start prioritizing on these. And so when you have everything all at once, that, everything's top important, super important, everything's number one priority, then nothing is. And that's where you fall into that trap of you know all these things you should be doing and you don't have the bandwidth to do them all. And at some point you have to let some of the balls drop. You can't juggle them all. At some point, you have to let something drop and say, you know what, these two things are not as important as this other thing. We have to go do this first to lay this foundation, and then we'll come and pick these other things up and we'll continue to build. But, it's not something that can be all done. Building a security program for, to get ready for SOC 2, starting from scratch, or to get ready for something like high trust or ISO 27001. I mean, those are 12 to 18 month projects easy. They don't all happen in a week, or like, you have to prioritize those things. And the strategy is a huge part of that. And by stepping back and being truly able to then prioritize strategically so that it's not, we're too busy to make things better. And that's how you do it. But you gotta start at the beginning and build out. Otherwise you have nothing to inform those decisions from a strategic point. And if you haven't gotten the buy-in from leadership on the framework and the governance first, it makes it really hard to get the buy-in for everything else, because you don't have anything to point back to say, this is why we're doing this. I'm proposing this endpoint tool, or I'm proposing that we bring in a SOC for 24/7 monitoring for a reason. And it's this reason because it aligns with our strategy that we have committed to doing.
Yeah.
So that's, it's.
And I appreciate that so much. And honestly, unfortunately, right now, I've got to let a few of the balls drop, because I feel like I got about 100 more questions I could ask you, but we've run out of time. So we do have to wrap it up. But thank you, AC, so much for joining us. Really, these are the kind of conversations we want to get to. I want to make sure that we're drawing it out, that need for the connection, and bringing in, maybe the voices that aren't those senior leaders to kind of see what the conversations are and what the attitudes are that are making a lot of these decisions. So keep joining us. We'll be back here every week. Accidental CISO, thank you so much for being here this week. Next week, we've got Jules Okofer, who's going to be here with us. 2 weeks from now, you heard AC mention his name earlier. I know ITSP was in the chat mentioning this too, but Wolfgang Garlick will be here on this show in 2 weeks. So be sure you keep checking back. Remember, the podcast version of this will be available in a couple days on the ITSP magazine website. AC, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fantastic. I enjoyed it. It was fun, and you've got a heck of a lineup coming up. So I encourage everybody to listen to the next few episodes. There's 2 more of my favorite people coming up.
Yeah, I can't believe how fortunate I've been so far, and I'm looking at the schedule going forward, and it's spectacular. A lot of great guests coming up, and some surprise guests too. I think you're going to see in coming weeks, we're going to have some folks on here that maybe you wouldn't have connected with some of the discussions that we're having. So stick around, join us every week. For now, we got to get out of here, but we'll see you again real soon on Securing Bridges.
Thanks, Alyssa.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Securing Bridges podcast with Alyssa Miller. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.